Hey, Christoph.
How you doing?
Good, good. So nice to have you on the show.
Very glad to be here.
You must be a popular guy right now with everything going on in the world.
Absolutely. Yes. The government's response to the whole COVID-19 coronavirus has been extraordinary, and it has a big effect on government contractors and subcontractors, for
Right.
sure.
Yeah. Well, today you're talking to contractors who want to be government contractors and subcontractors. I think, in light of what the country needs to get products and services out that are going to help us rebuild the economy and rebuild.
Yeah.
That's why I think you're busy, because you kind of have the keys. You know how to get government contracts.
That's right. Yeah. So my background is I used to be a federal contracting officer. So that's the person on behalf of the United States government. I was a federal employee. I was the one who was signing those contracts. I was negotiating those contracts. I was the one designing those requests for proposals or RFPs, and I was the one evaluating them and picking the winners. So that gave me quite a bit of insight into how that whole game works.
Wow. What's a day in the life of a guy in that position? A person in that position. What's a day in the life like for you guys?
So, in my former life, when I was a federal employee as a contracting officer, the first thing I can tell you is that they are extremely busy, and that's
Hmm.
every day. So, now, in the middle of a global pandemic, they are even more busier than normal. And so, what's the takeaway for you as a business owner who wants to work with the United States government? Be very respectful of a contracting officer's time. That means whenever you get lucky enough to be on the phone with a contracting officer, you need to have all your ducks in a row. You need to have all the facts right in front of you. Don't be looking things up on the phone. Have everything ready. Have a plan. Have a three-step process of this is my goal, this is my takeaway, this is what I'm going to ask the government to do for me.
Hmm.
So if you have a modification request for your contract, for instance, you should already have basically a draft outline of what you're going to ask for. Come with a plan. If you do that, your contracting officer will respect you and probably give you a little bit more time on the phone.
Oh,
If you
wow.
don't, your contracting officer might become very good at, let's just say, spending less time with you and more time with some of the other contractors because their time is absolutely limited. So never
Yeah.
forget that.
That's really good advice. And the reason I invited you on the show is your book, which I can see behind you there, Government Contracts in Plain English. Um,
Yeah.
and lots of people rate books, but you've got a whole schwack of five-star reviews. So I took that as a good endorsement for just the plain English part of what you were talking about.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm very happy to see that I'm getting excellent feedback on the book. I'm getting great reviews on Amazon, and a lot of clients and also potential future clients have emailed me personally and said, "Wow, Christoph, this book has opened my eyes." And the goal of my book was, of course, right there in the title. So, look, I'm an attorney. I've published like 75 articles over the years, right? I can read the scholarly stuff. But look, what we really need is the plain English version, okay?
Mm.
So there's plenty of books out there where there's a million footnotes and it's in very small type, and it's basically written for lawyers and it's written for people like me. So what I pride myself on is giving people the bottom line up front and the plain English explanation. So the title just flowed naturally from that, and the book is written in a very conversational tone. It's answering frequently asked questions, and it's giving you the basics of what you need, and you will not need to refer to some footnote or read some legal case. It's me, an expert, giving to you the bottom line up front in plain English, and it's a lot of the insights and tips and practical knowledge that I've built up over my career so that you can take advantage of that too.
Yeah. Well, I like the fact that it's in plain English, and I think a lot of us do. You know, the where it even came to me to contact you was through the listeners, because the people listening to this are trade contractors. They could
Yeah,
be making cabinetry, which means they're going to be making medical lab equipment, hospital equipment. They could be an HVAC, which is heating ventilation. Sorry, you've probably bought those contracts. They could be an HVAC because of the negative airflow requirements for sterilization units and operating rooms. They could be doing solar because power backups now become a question front and center. There's so many different trades that now have an opportunity to get into government contracting that never did before. And if the reason I asked you what a day in the life is like for you is because a lot of the people listening have never gone into getting government contracts. Where do you even start?
so where do you start with government contracts? Well, let me distinguish them from private sector contracts. First of all, government contracts, Uncle Sam, the United States federal government, we are talking about the biggest client in the history of the world by far.
Wow.
Uncle Sam, yeah, absolutely, bar none. Uncle Sam, the United States federal government, is spending about $1 trillion, that's trillion with a T, folks, $1 trillion per year on contracts, grants, acquisitions, other forms of assistance. So you can be a part of that. But what you need to know about United States federal government contracts is that they're very, very different from the private contracts, the business-to-business contracts that you may be used to, okay? So just to give you a taste of some of the extremely strange things that you might not know about, let me just tell you this. We have, first of all, there's a clause called the termination for convenience clause, okay?
That sounds ominous.
It sounds, it makes you think of time-traveling cyborg robots that will terminate you, right? Termination for convenience doesn't sound very good, does it?
No.
Well, it's not. It's really not. So this is a standard clause that's going to be in almost every one of your non-commercial government contracts, and it allows the government to terminate your contract.
The contract, not me as a human.
Yeah, terminate your contract on a whim. And so normally, let's say, me and Dom, we have a contract together, right? It's 5 years, $50 million. And let's say Dom has invested, $10 million towards completing this contract. And then I just break it in year 2, right? Well, of course, Dom can now sue me for his, what we call expectation damages, right? I broke the deal. Dom is owed money. He needs to be made whole. We're all familiar with this principle.
Right.
Well, in federal contracts with the United States government, they can terminate you for convenience at any time, at any day, and you will not be eligible for any of those benefits. In other words, you're fired, you're done, the contract's over, and then you are not made whole. You do not get the remainder of the contract. Those 3 years that you thought you had, it's out the window.
So there's risk. There's a risk to these as well.
Biggest client in the history of the world, but we always know with great risk comes great reward, right?
Yeah. So how do I, if I've never done a government contract before, let's say that I'm something simple. Let's say I'm making laboratory cabinets and a new federal hospital is being built and I want to bid on that job. How do I even find them? And then how do I respond?
So finding them, it's lucky, it's good for you. We have a very, very transparent system, okay? So in United States federal government contracting, all public available contracts are going to be publicized, and it's all on the same website. It used to be called FBO, Federal Business Opportunities, fbo.gov. It is now moved over to a new website, and it's called sam.gov, sam.gov. So it's systemforawardmanagement.gov, and it's right now in the beta version, but any government contract opportunity like that, type in sam.gov, and it's, again, people are going to throw around the term fbo.gov. It's been migrated over to SAM. But the basic principle to understand is that you have the same opportunity as everybody else by law. So the government wants all comers. They want everybody to submit a quote or a proposal if possible, and there is a central repository for you to look these up.
So lots of our listeners are used to fulfilling RFPs because they're dealing with big general contractors already, and they're responding to variously called, and you would know this as an attorney, RFPs, RFQs, RFIs, depending on how that company has their things set up.
Sure.
But are there 3 big mistakes people make, or how many mistakes, common game stoppers are there in answering an RFP?
So with government contracts, when you're responding to this request for proposal, the first thing you need to understand is strict compliance is the name of the game. And that's pretty much, that's often a big factor in almost any kind of proposal that's competitive. But with United States federal government contracting, there is no wiggle room. So because of these laws that we have to ensure fairness, to make sure that everybody has, kind of an equal opportunity to compete with each other, you can severely prejudice yourself by leaving out one tiny little detail in your proposal. And if the government decides we're too busy, we're not going to negotiate again, we're not going to allow everybody to submit a new proposal, You could have the best proposal out of everybody, bar none, objectively speaking, even the best price. But because you didn't meet the strict compliance and you're missing one tiny little required piece, you're what's called deficient. A deficiency sounds terrible, doesn't it?
It's horrible. I just inhaled and you said it. I was like, oh no, I'm deficient.
We don't want to have a deficiency, right?
Right.
Because you could have what's called a weakness, sure, and you could still be awardable. But if you have one single deficiency, if there's one thing that you were required to submit or that you submitted incorrectly, you are simply ineligible for award. The government contracting officer cannot give you that award, even if we both know that you are the superior one. To get you that award when you have a deficiency, they have to open up to you and to everybody else that's basically in the competitive range the opportunity to revise their proposal, right? So think about it this way. If you get to pick and choose and make one little small adjustment to your proposal to get rid of your deficiency in the interests of fairness, everybody else has to be afforded that same opportunity. So as a former contracting officer, I can tell you, many such times the government is going to make that decision and say, no, we are not allowing anybody to make revisions. I'm sorry, your company has that deficiency. You're not going to be afforded an opportunity to fix it. So don't let that happen to you. Follow that solicitation. You need to mark it down, every single little requirement that's in there.
Right.
You need to be very careful with that.
Can you, just for curiosity and for people listening that have professional estimating teams, these are people, contractors who have rooms full of people who are doing estimating and responding to RFPs in some cases. And in some cases, it's the owner doing it themselves, piling more work on themselves. What is an example of a deficiency in a contract response?
It could be as simple as, so first of all, one deficiency could be that your response just is so unimpressive. It's not technically sufficient. Whatever you wrote down or explained to the government as being your solution, they just said, we have zero confidence in this offer. You are thumbs down deficient. So that's a possibility, but just forgetting something could be a deficiency. So let me give you a quick example. Many times they're going to rate or evaluate you based on, let's say, 3 factors. So they'll say, number 1, price. Number 2, your technical capabilities, what you write in the proposal, your solution. And then maybe number 3 is what they call past performance, very common. They want to know, how well have you done this before? Can I contact a few of your prior clients? So in the past performance factor, they might say, give me a minimum. Whenever you see that word minimum, write that down, right? Because if you don't meet the minimum, you might be deficient. But let's say you need a minimum of, we'll say 3 past performance references, and they have to be relevant, and they have to be within the past 4 years. Well, let's say you give them 3, but one of your 3 was in, let's say, 8 years ago, and it wasn't from 4 years ago. You could be judged to be deficient. You have not provided every little thing that they asked for. Or it could be, maybe there's like 6 factors that they're going to rate you on, and you forgot to submit the 6th category. That could be a deficiency as well.
In my mind, I see the requirement to almost have tick boxes, like to make sure I've ticked all the boxes, to go through it and look for those key words.
Dom, you hit the nail on the head. Checking off and using little tick boxes makes me think of what I like to call, this is a little bit of jargon, a work breakdown structure or requirements matrix. There's all these different terms for it. Everybody uses a different phrase. Maybe they're different in Canada than in the United States. It doesn't matter. What you need to know in plain English is be formulaic, write down in some way, and organize in some way every single requirement in that request for proposal. And then when you have your proposal professionals creating that proposal, you need to link that back up formulaically, step by step. Every single piece of your proposal needs to line up exactly with each of those requirements. Because again, when you're dealing with government contracts, compliance is key. You can't leave things out because you might not be afforded the opportunity to make a tiny little revision in your proposal. Remember that this might be your, best and final proposal that you're ever going to submit. So you got to get it right that first time.
So it makes me wonder, are there hints? I mean, you're a professional. You could probably look at 2 or 3 different RFPs out there and you know that this one here, even though it's being put out for public tender, they've already chosen who's going to win it. Is that a fair assumption on my side? Are there hints that we could look for to know that this is an unwinnable RFP?
There absolutely are little hints like that. So
Wow, really?
yeah, absolutely. So this is a lot of the work that I do for clients, right? Clients come to me and they have a specific RFP and they want me to translate it for them, right? Because the government does use, trade terms, terms of art, jargon, and there are very specific signals that you can find within that. And that's part of what I do. I look at it, I write them back, I talk to them on the phone, and I say, here's what your win strategy needs to be, right? So anybody that is in the proposal field, they are usually thinking of something called what's my win theme? What's my win strategy, right? What's going to distinguish me from all my competitors? What's going to give the client a reason to pick me?
Right.
So by looking at that RFP, how about we just go through a couple of these little jargon phrases that you might see?
Sure.
And then I'll translate them for you. So one of them is this dichotomy between the way they rate you and the way they pick the winner. Okay. So one of them is called trade-off, which some people call best value.
Right.
And then the other is LPTA. Now, LPTA, that stands for lowest price technically acceptable. So these are on two ends of the spectrum, but these are very common methods that the government is going to use to evaluate your proposal. And you, as a business owner, you absolutely need to understand the fundamental difference between the two. Let me give you the best example. So let me ask you, Dom, if you're going to pick a surgeon for life-saving surgery for you, right?
Right.
Do you want to get the bottom dollar, cheapest, bare minimum surgeon that just barely passed the medical board and, he's just barely good enough, but he's absolutely the cheapest one? Do you want that, Dom?
No, that's a great example.
You probably don't want that, right?
No, I don't want that guy messing around with my internal organs. And
you would be willing to pay a little bit more for a superior surgeon, right? You'd be willing to pay what's called a price premium. So in this scenario that we're talking about, that's what the government means when they say trade-off. Some people call it best value, but the real word is called a trade-off, source selection. So in those, the government has the most amount of flexibility. They could choose the most superior capability that costs a little bit more, or they could not. It's all based on that price premium, right? Are we willing to pay an extra $1 million for much better past performance, much better technical capabilities? So in a situation like that, you have some decisions to make. You need to understand that, well, I'm a little bit more expensive than my competitors. Is that justified? And you really don't know what the government's going to pick. Will they go high with superior capabilities and pay a little bit more? Or maybe you should find yourself more in the middle of the range. Or maybe you go cheap and you think they were kind of not so honest with their willingness to actually pay that price premium. It's all over the map with a trade-off. That's what you need to know.
Right. This is a lot like chess. It's not checkers. This is chess. There's a lot of moves on the board.
This is complicated stuff. Yeah. So Dom, we have people called proposal professionals, and then we have people called capture strategists. And the capture type people are doing what I'm describing to you right now, thinking about win themes. Are we competitive? So we talked about trade-off just then. Now, trade-off again means the government is willing to pay more for superior capabilities. On the other end of the spectrum, let's talk about this lowest price technically acceptable. That's a signal to you that this entire proposal competition is based on one factor, price, right? So the LPTA, it's all in the name, right? Lowest price, technically acceptable. So think about it. You're about to go to an amusement park and jump on the roller coaster. You must be this tall to ride this roller coaster, right?
Sure.
That's what technical acceptability means. They're going to have a minimum standard. As long as you meet that minimum standard, you are going to be racked and stacked, and whoever has the cheapest price wins. Okay.
That's almost a commodity purchase.
Dom, you must be some sort of a psychic, because they often use LPTA for supplies and commodities because they're fungible, right? Right. If you can provide the Dell XP laptop, it's all the same model. That's technically acceptable. I want the lowest price, right? Now, if we're talking about services or things that are not fungible, where you can distinguish between competitors and I don't want to say the product, but what you're delivering. If they say LPTA, you have to keep something in mind. You will not be rewarded for having superior capabilities. Remember that. So even if you are 10 times better than your competitor, if you're superior and you're 10 times better, you get no credit for that. All you get credit for is, are you tall enough to ride this roller coaster?
Right.
Did you meet technical acceptability? And then you're going to be battling on price, and that's it. So to summarize, those two key factors on
it's a big spectrum, isn't it? It's for, you've either got on the left or on the right, and you're gonna choose.
Dom, I think you're letting on to your viewers that you actually know a lot more about government contracts, I think, because you just said spectrum, and it's
You said a thing?
That's exactly what it's called. It's called the best value spectrum. And on one end of the best value spectrum, you have trade-off, where you can pay more for superior capabilities. And then on the other end, you have LPTA, where it's lowest price technically acceptable. As long as you're good enough, we want the cheapest price. So that's probably one of those little jargon terms that means a lot. There's a lot to unpack there. So whenever you see that, one or the other, that's going to inform your pricing strategy. That's going to inform your win themes, right?
Wow. Okay. What's another sort of piece of jargon that we should look for when we're looking at government contracts? And by the way, but as I ask you that question, this isn't all that different than private industry RFPs, because in order to win a private industry RFP, and even with mega corporations and larger general contractors, you still have to tick all the boxes or you just get rejected.
That's right. That's right. So there's absolutely similarities like that. Here's one that's probably going to be a little bit different. So we've probably all heard of past performance or experience. Well, in the United States federal government contracting, there is a big difference between the two. Past performance is used far more commonly than experience as a rating factor, an evaluation factor, okay? There's a special rule where they want to encourage newcomers into the government contracts market. So if past performance is a factor and you don't have any relevant past performance,
with government, you mean?
With the government, that's right. You can submit that and you can formally say, I do not have sufficient past performance. And in most cases, there's a rule that says you will be rated neither favorably nor unfavorably, in plain English, neutral. So it's not going to hurt you. So think about it. They don't want to exclude people that are new, right? They want to have newcomers. So here's what I learned when I was a federal contracting officer. There is a way to exclude the newcomers, and this is how you do it. Instead of only using past performance, you can use a rating factor called experience. Experience, doesn't that sound very familiar? It sounds almost the same as past performance, right? But here's the trick. With past performance, we have a rule that says if you have none, you're going to be rated neutrally. If you use experience, there is no such rule. So what's the difference? Past performance is like a report card. Yes, you've done it, and here's your grades. Here's how well you've done it. Experience is just straight up, have you done it, yes or no? So if you see experience listed as a rating factor, that is a dead giveaway that one of those government contracting officers is pretty sharp. Maybe they took one of my courses, maybe they read that chapter of my book, but what they're doing is subtly signaling to you, hey, look, if you've never done this before, zero chance.
If you haven't sold us toothbrushes before, you're not selling us toothbrushes now.
Yeah, and they'd be unlikely to do it in a supply environment. But if you think about services and things like that, that's probably where they might try to exclude newcomers, because they might say that this is a mission critical contract. We cannot take the risk on this one.
Right.
If you want to be a newcomer to the market, check out those other contracts. But this one is for something very important. So we want to make sure we've had people that have, been around the block before.
So I'm going to put COVID-19 on the table.
Oh, yes.
The most common word we've never used before. Suddenly in the last couple of weeks, it's all over the place. How has government contracting changed due to the COVID-19 pandemic?
So it has changed a lot. And I guess in our practical lives, I've got to say, I'm sure we've all got an email from almost every single company that you've done business with in the last 20 years, right?
Oh, yeah.
My online bank, restaurants, airlines, cruise ships, everybody has sent you an email about COVID-19 and their coronavirus response, right?
Yeah.
But I can tell you objectively, things actually have changed in a very big way with federal contracts. So there's been an unprecedented congressional legislative response to help out this specific industry, right?
Right.
I told you earlier, government contracts, biggest client in the history of the world. There's a lot of government contractors in the United States and worldwide. By the way, now is a good time to tell your listeners that, a frequently asked question is, can I be a non-US based company and still get United States government contracts, and including small business set-asides? The answer is yes.
Oh, wow.
So because this is such a big industry and because it's vital to national security, they've actually passed laws that allow federal contractors to bill the government to get a modification to their existing contract to keep their essential staff on staff, keep them being paid, even if they're idle, even if they're not working. They're essentially, it's the closest thing you'll see to a blank check ever, where they're directing the contracting officers to negotiate in good faith and give you a modification. Now, why are they doing that? Because look, if we have this lockdown for a month, 2 months, who knows? What we don't want to do is return back to normal and then, oh my goodness, look what happened. The entire government shortage of labor, the government contracting industry has been hollowed out. All of these businesses now have 50%, maybe 25% of the staff that they had before. So there's been a flurry of memos, and there's also been action by Congress. So it's come all the way down from the Secretary of Defense to the policy director for all of the Department of Defense. It's came from OMB, all the major authorities that work in government contracts. Right. They've issued memos basically saying that we want you to keep your staff on staff. We don't want you to let them go. And we are willing to help you out and make a modification to actually pay for that. And again, that's extraordinary, because contrast that with how it normally works. Normally, if let's say a federal employee, there's a federal holiday, the government employees, they get that holiday off. The government contractors, that's up to you. You're an employee of a company.
It's part of your cost, yeah.
It's part of your cost. Your CEO has to work out what days you're off, buddy, right? You don't get to just follow the government schedule. Yeah. And so that's one big thing. And then another big change would be telework. So welcome to the year 2020, Dom. Some of us have been ahead of the game with telework, right? You and I both.
Right.
But I think everybody else is really catching up to telework now that we have to. And don't leave out the federal government and the federal contractors, because telework has become the name of the game over the past few weeks, and that's not going to change as far as I can see. So again, normally if the United States government employees are allowed to telework, they're going to be agnostic and maybe even, not so enthusiastic about the contractors teleworking. That has changed overnight.
Security concerns in the past, as far as I knew about government contracts, is security was paramount, and you couldn't have telework because of then the introduced security risk for that.
That's exactly right. So not only have they written memos encouraging the government to allow the contractors to telework, but on top of that, it's the first thing that I mentioned, where if you work in a secure environment, they call them a SCIF. If you're a cleared contractor, you go into the super secret squirrel room. You're not allowed to take that room with you back to your house, right? And you certainly can't be calling on your home phone. So those types of contractors were, for a few days, they were awkwardly stuck at home. They can't do their job. They're not allowed to work from home, right? So anybody who couldn't take advantage of the flexible telework situation, I think that was the source of the lobbying and the legislative change that, they made the leaders think, wait a minute, if these people can't work, their company won't pay them. If their company won't pay them, they'll be laid off. When we get back to work in however long, 3 months, I don't know how long this is going to be, we want to make sure we still have what they call the defense industrial base, the collection of federal and defense contractors, which they've absolutely considered that to be part of, vital to national security.
So this is something that I've given a lot of thought to, and I think you're probably the right guy to ask this. People, when we think of essential services, you think of in the normal sense of the normal world, which we are not in anymore, but essential services is fire, police, ambulance. When I think of government essential services, I think trade contractors might feel they're not going to be part of that net. But in my mind, even somebody that makes pallets that are required to move medical equipment would have to be able to run their pallet factory so that you could put ventilators on a pallet and put it on a truck, which also has to be an essential service. So it doesn't mean that just because you're making the ventilator or the hose on the ventilator, you're an essential service. And I want you to correct me and shoot me right out of the sky. But am I wrong in thinking that all of that supply chain, all of the things that are needed to get that ventilator to a federal hospital are required?
Dom, you're right. You're right. You need to be thinking.
Oh, thank God, because I was taking a leap there.
No. You're right. The term essential and mission critical has been expanded greatly due to
Mm.
COVID-19. There are specific memos that I've been sending to clients where they're showing, normally with mission essential, you think it's going to be defense based or something. Um, Absolutely, medical is going to be part of the mission essential. We have something called the Defense Production Act. So I was recently quoted in a Bloomberg article about the Defense Production Act. The
Uh-huh.
Defense Production Act is not just about defense contracts. The Defense Production Act allows the government to prioritize and allocate things like medical supplies. And that's exactly what President Trump used it for. He invoked it in an executive order. He'll potentially exercise that later for things like masks, ventilators. But look, the United States government and the Department of Defense, the military, they know that it's not just about the supplies, it's how do you get the supplies there.
Right.
What we like to call it logistics, right? Some people
That's
even
the word I was looking for. Logistics, right?
Some people would even say that World War II and major wars are won on the logistics supply chain. So the United States government has always taken a very broad view of what is that defense industrial base? What are those mission critical contractors? And now, in a time of national emergency, in a time of a global pandemic, of course that definition has been broadened, and that is backed up by legit memos by leaders of the United States government in the government contracting sphere. Absolutely.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Broad.
I'm so glad to hear that, because I think a lot of people just out of hand would dismiss it and say, well, we don't make ventilators, so it doesn't matter. You could be making pallets. You could be making solar panel mounting systems. Those could be considered part of the essential service. And those contracts now are available, I would suppose, on the sam.gov website.
That's right. That's right. And let me throw you another bonus with that too. So as far as the method of procurement, the way the government buys, they have many options. There's all these different lanes, right? Different types of processes. Well, it's always easier if they pick the simplified processes. One of them is actually called simplified acquisition procedures, right?
Oh, wow.
So because we're in the middle of a national emergency in this pandemic, the threshold, the dollar thresholds that they're allowed to buy up to with the easiest methods, such as simplified acquisitions, those thresholds have moved up.
I would imagine, yeah.
For instance, simplified acquisitions, it used to be a limit of $7 million for things like commercial supplies or services. It's now at 13, and it's at $13 million at the discretion of the contracting officer. So in other words, to return to your question of what's considered mission essential, what's part of the response to COVID, it's up to the contracting officer. And again, they're going to take a very broad view. If the contracting officer determines, I need to get those medical supplies out there, they can say, I deem this contract to be in response to COVID-19, and that gives them a flurry of extra flexibility. It gives them a lot of speed, and it gives them a lot of easier methods to actually do that procurement. So they can absolutely look at your contract that's part of the logistics supply chain, or part of the medical cabinetry, or any of the other supplies, or the transportation, or really anything. If they can tie it to a response to COVID-19, you are going to be afforded those same acquisition and contracting flexibilities.
Let's dial this forward 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. Are we looking right now at a time when it's going to be, I don't want to say easier than ever, but the best opportunity ever to start getting into government contracts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always optimistic. This is my industry, and what I do is I help out existing government contractors, ones who already have it. I help them navigate this field. I help them work with the contracting officer. I help them get paid or get a modification of their contract. But one of the other things I do is I help out newcomers to the government contracting space. I mean, I'm your shepherd. I'm here to translate it in plain English. I'm your expert to help you along in the process. And I actually have been, indeed, flooded with a lot more requests than I get than usual. Normally people are asking and saying, look, I'm going to start a new government contracting business, and I want to do it in HVAC, or I want to move my private sector medical supply company into some of those health and human resources and Department of Defense contracts. I'm probably getting double to triple the amount of requests that I normally get. And I think that's because we have an unprecedented response. We've realized that we're a little bit short on some of these supplies. We need to have a quick response. And let's pull out the crystal ball, shall we, Dom? Let's pull out the crystal ball, and we might say that this response to COVID-19 has unearthed a little bit of a dearth, a little bit of some missing factors in the supply chain, the service chain, the medical industry, the defense industry, the transportation industry, and also the import-export. I think we'd be crazy not to predict that the United States government is going to try to fix this problem in the future by bolstering, our logistical supply chain for medical supplies and a whole lot of other.
In-country supply chains, because it's obviously faster response than trying to wait for it to come by shipping boat, a container barge from another continent.
You got it. And as far as growth in general in the government contracting space, if there were no epidemic, pandemic, or national emergency, my answer would probably be the same, which is that, do I expect this industry to grow? Absolutely. It grows almost every year. It grows in tandem with the United States federal government's budget in general, right? Remember what we're talking about. We're talking about buying things on behalf of the United States government, the biggest client in the history of the world. Right. And generally speaking, that budget keeps going up, and that means that the government keeps spending and buying more things. And let me just put a cap on this one for you. People ask me all the time, they say, Christoph, what does the government buy? The answer is, if you can think of it, there's a 99% chance that the government has bought it, is buying it now, and wants to buy it in the future. Yeah. Look around the room.
Everything.
Computer providers, right? Glasses, clothing, weapons, services, construction. It's really anything that you can think about. The government buys it. Most people get in their head and they think, oh yeah, government contracts. That's jets, submarines, tanks. Well, that's a big part of it. And those are very expensive. And I have a lot of clients that do that, right? But I have clients in every industry you could imagine: IT, security, medical, construction, commercial services, everything. So don't be shy. If you think, oh, I bet the government doesn't buy that, send me an email. I guarantee you I can find you a solicitation where they're looking for what you sell.
Well, lots of our listeners will have had military experience. And so they remember being issued their military kit, whatever it was, all of that. And I often joke about toothbrushes, just because you wouldn't think of toothbrushes, but toothbrushes have to be sold to the military. Somebody's job is to procure toothbrushes for the military, for the government, whatever application they need. And so that becomes a real strategy. You have to think about how we're going to sell these it's a toothbrush. But they don't just go to the grocery store like the rest of us do walking down the streets. They have to buy them in bulk, millions at a time, and they have to meet technical specifications and things you would never imagine for a toothbrush or a razor blade or shaving cream or the rack that holds an IV supply, right? All of that has to be built.
That's exactly right. And they're not going out to the store and buying them one at a time. They're doing what's called strategic sourcing. There's a lot of different names for this, but what it means is I have a big enterprise. I have millions of people on my team. I need to buy in bulk, and I need to have it streamlined, and there has to be a very efficient way of getting it to them. Well, guess what? If you're a company that can position themselves as efficient, on-time delivery at bulk pricing rates, you just cornered the market, right? That's what you want. And let me give you a taste of what that could be for you. In United States government contracting, we have something called the GSA schedule. We have an agency called General Services Administration, GSA, and then the schedule contract. Think of a big master IDIQ contract where you place orders against it, right? If you can get a GSA schedule for products and services like that, then you can get these orders that can be placed from every single federal agency, not just GSA. So GSA sets up the master contract for these commodity supplies at bulk pricing discounts. And that could be your ticket to doing a lot of business with the United States government contracting industry.
You know what my takeaway from this, Christoph, is that I can't wing it. If I want to get into government contracts, I see the opportunity, I see the timeliness of it, but it doesn't sound like I can wing it. Is that the case?
I got to tell you, Dom, winging it is not a good idea. Government contracts is a complicated business. It's highly regulated. They have very strange accounting requirements. We've already talked about how hard it is to be compliant, and they have very strict compliant rules. you got to get help. You really do. I mean, ask me to help you. If you don't want to hire me, please hire somebody else. Okay, hire somebody who's an expert in government contracts to help you along the way. You absolutely need that outside consultant or somebody in-house in your company who's an expert. If you're not an expert, you need to find them, okay? It's an insulated, specialized niche industry. Any money that you pay to get yourself an expert who can explain to you, hold your hand, walk you through the process in the initial steps, that is money well spent. I highly recommend that you do that. Well,
and let me put on the table, though, the question about profitability. I'm sure it goes without saying, but I've got you here on the interview. Are these still profitable contracts? Like, is there a reason to go after this? Can I make money selling to the government?
Can you make money selling to the United States government? Absolutely.
Sorry, I know that sounds basic, but what I'm hearing from you is I'm going to need to retool my operations. I'm going to have to think a little bit differently about how I run my business. I might have to hire a specialist. I might have to change my accounting systems a bit. Okay, let's put that all on the table. What am I going to get for that? Is there a return? And so you say, yeah?
I say yes, absolutely. It's the risk and reward spectrum is there. What you do need to understand, though, is if you've been working in the private sphere, your business is mature, successful, you know what you're doing, and you've been doing business to business, and then you say, let's move into government contracting. What you do not do is just dive right in and not make any preparations, don't hire an expert. That would be a huge mistake. I have counseled many companies that tried that first before they actually came to me and did it the right way. The reason why you can't do that is because, as you touched upon, there are different indirect expenses that are going to come up. Your back office, your corporate office, your accounting system, your compliance, maybe your outside legal counsel, things like that. Your indirect costs are absolutely going to go up. The good news is, I've said it once, I've said it twice, I'll say it again. The biggest client in the history of the planet Earth is the United States federal government. So there's a lot of money out there, about $1 trillion per year. And as far as your indirect expenses going up, remember this point. There's two main families of government contracts. One is called fixed price. One is called cost reimbursement. Okay, fixed price means $500 is a deal. Don't tell me anything else about details. I give you $500, you finish the job. In such a case as a fixed price contract, you got to remember that capture all those indirect costs, all those additional compliance costs, that's got to be rolled up into your final price or rolled up into your labor hour rate for your employees that you charge, right? If you go into the cost reimbursement sphere, that's a little bit more complex. But in the cost reimbursement sphere, the government is actually reimbursing your company for its incurred costs, as long as they're allowable, allocable to the contract, and reasonable, which is, subjective. But my point in the cost reimbursement part is those additional indirect costs where you have to hire more people, get specialized accountants, go through specialized processes. Those are, in fact, paid for the government. So that's one advantage. Now, the problem with those indirect costs being paid for, if you chase those cost reimbursement contracts, you're in the big boy leagues. Those are usually for larger contracts. They're usually among the very big and established defense contractors. So again, risk and reward. So the strategy for you that I recommend often, case by case, but as a generalized principle, you might want to chase those firm fixed price contracts first. So you can dip your toe in the water. You know what's on the table. You know the risks. You can start to get your past performance, and then you can build yourself up to larger clients, and you can slowly build up that back office. You can get your experts on hand. You can get your accounting system in a way that it needs to be compliant. And then maybe you can dip into the more complicated, high administrative cost reimbursement contracts where they're actually going to pay you back for those additional indirect costs. And Dom, one more thing for breaking into the government contracts industry. Another great strategy that I advise clients all the time is, let me just put it to you this way. If you're the prime contractor, if you're the one that has the contract with the government, everything is on you. Everything. You are 100% responsible for whatever your subcontractors do, okay? So you get the biggest piece of the pie. You get the best profit margin, right? But you have all the risk. So a really smart strategy is to try to break your way into the government contracts industry, into that new market, by starting off as a subcontractor, right? So you could be a subcontractor to one of these established prime contractors. And that way you can carve out your specific domain, right? You're only going to be responsible for your little piece of the subcontract. And then you're not subject to that immense risk of failure or embarrassment or civil or criminal penalties or scary stuff like that, because you're still—
it sounds scary. Yeah.
It can be very scary being a prime contractor with the government. There's very high risks, including criminal penalties, which is why you need to have an expert helping you. But if you're a subcontractor, let me explain this in plain English. People say, oh yeah, I'm a federal subcontractor. Yeah, I'm a defense contractor. Technically speaking, you are in a business-to-business relationship. Okay, I get that you're part of the supply chain. I get that your prime contractor is Lockheed Martin or Boeing. But legally speaking, when you sue each other, you're going to be in state court somewhere. Okay, that's a business-to-business contract, a business-to-business dispute, right? If you're the prime contractor and you have a problem with the United States government, now you're subject to what we call government contracts law, right? My specialty field, right?
It's a different animal.
Oh, it's such a different animal, Dom. And I'll give you the bottom line up front. The rules for government contract law are, drum roll, please, incredibly weighted towards the United States government.
I would imagine they would be, yeah.
Is this a surprise? I
mean, general contractors do the same thing. You know, their clauses are incredibly one-sided. I could only imagine what the government would do.
That's right. So you guys are familiar with they say some things roll downhill. We won't say what rolls downhill, but we've all heard that phrase, right? So prime contractors know that. They're going to put all the best terms and conditions, and they're going to flow those down to their subcontractors, right? Well, who's the star of the show, the biggest client in the history of the world at the end of the line is the United States federal government. And guess what they get to do, Dom? They get to write laws. And they have written laws over the years, and those laws are almost always going to be favoring the United States government in a very big way.
So maybe we should have started this. Maybe we need you back again to talk about how to be a subcontractor to a prime contractor as a way to get into government contracts. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely. So as much as I've been talking about being a prime contractor with the United States government, being a subcontractor is a whole nother industry and an opportunity. And I actually do counsel a lot of clients who exist completely as a subcontractor. So these business owners have made that decision. They've said, I'm weighing the risks and reward. I'm looking at how much my overhead will be. And they've made the semi-permanent, it could change, but they've made the semi-permanent business decision to say, I don't want a prime contract with the government. It's too much risk, too much cost, whatever their reason is. They've decided to permanently stay a subcontractor. And I will tell you, the negotiations, the flow down clauses, how to deal with primes and subcontractors, that's absolutely a topic that I cover in my book, because that's a big part of my consulting business, is helping out not just the prime contractors, but also helping out the subcontractors, of course.
You know, I was just going to ask you how people get in touch with you. And I guess I've been talking to you. For those of you who are listening to this as an audio, this is being recorded as a video as well. And Christoph has in the background some of his books, and it's the book Government Contracts in Plain English, the one that we would know. I know you've written legal papers, but tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so Government Contracts in Plain English, right? So my inspiration to write this was I want to have a handbook for the business owner, for the professional who works in the government contracting space. I need to give you the bottom line up front, all the best insider advice, the tips and the tricks that you may not have thought about. You know, it's all that kind of good stuff in a very conversational tone, very easy to read. And it's coming from me, a former contracting officer, somebody who actually knows about this industry. And this is what I do in my career. So you can buy Government Contracts in Plain English. It's available on Amazon in both paperback and in Kindle editions.
Yeah. And that's where I found you. As I said, you had multiple 5-star reviews, which I think speaks to the fact that the whole in plain English part is so hard to access. I mean, you've unpacked a bunch of things today. There was a ton of value, but what I realized just at the end of our interview is that this whole subcontract to the prime contractor might be the safest entry point. And I guess you cover that, as you said in the book.
Absolutely. It's in there specifically, explicitly in the book as a strategy for you to break into the market. I also cover the proposal process. What are the different things about government contracts? I go over how to deal with the contracting officer. I go over modifications, how to ask for a modification to your contract.
Interesting. So many people think they can't be modified. And I know that if you have the right strategy, you have to approach it the right way. But I don't know those ways. I'm not you or one of the professionals like you. So you're saying you can actually take that agreement, or that in this process, you can make some changes.
Not only can you make changes, you're gonna have to maybe convince the contracting officer. But let me throw one more strange thing about government contracts at you. You are entitled to a modification to your contract because there's something called the changes clause, another ominous clause like that terminations clause I mentioned before, right? So there's something called the changes clause. The changes clause allows the government to issue unilateral changes, as in you do not have to comply. So the government can just wake up and decide, yeah, we need to change the aluminum to steel. Right. And you have to comply, because when you sign the initial contract, and the initial contract had the changes clause within it, you were agreeing to comply with anything within the scope of the contract. You will comply with those changes. Now, that's an extraordinary power of the government. That's something very different from a lot of the private sector contracts you're used to.
Yeah.
But here's where it comes in for you. Because of that changes clause, because the government can unilaterally require you to do something differently, in turn, you are then entitled to what's called an equitable adjustment. Now, in plain English, an equitable adjustment just means money, right? Yeah. Contract modification, right? So,
well, there's a big price difference between steel and stainless steel, or steel and aluminum.
Sure. So when the government issues you that unilateral change order in writing, you are then entitled to get a modification to pay you to comply with those costs. And one more thing about that, here's some more free advice for you out there. Just because you didn't get an email or a written modification using the changes clause, that does not mean that you're not entitled to that modification. It's something called a constructive change. So not like the construction industry, but constructive change. It means something changed even though you didn't get a formal modification or a formal written email, but because of something the government did or did not do, your costs just went up, or your schedule just got pushed out, or you had to do something extra. That indeed also entitles you to a modification, what we call an equitable adjustment, and yes, more money.
So it's interesting. In your introduction, you referred to yourself as a shepherd through these government contracts. And now I understand a little bit. I understand a little bit more about what you mean, because if I was going to go into this, I would need a professional such as yourself. I mean, you're here today educating us, and you happen to do this. There's others that do it as well. But now I see why you called yourself a shepherd, because I wouldn't know to make sure that clause was in there. Because if a prime contractor tried to push a subcontract to me and took that out intentionally, or maybe they forgot, somebody with your training would say, hey, let's make sure that's back in there so that we have the flexibility in the future.
You're touching on flow downs and the clauses that you have to.
Well, you see, it turns out I'm a professional on government contracts and plain English. I'm not, Christoph, but I like to make jokes.
I think a lot of your skills from general contracting and primes and subs and clause negotiations, a lot of those skills will absolutely translate and help you in the government contracting sphere. It's just those unknown unknowns that come up where you didn't even know that could have been a risk. That's where you need an expert to point things like that out to you. Like it sounds so innocuous. Oh yeah, the changes clause. Or, if you didn't happen to read the tiny fine print that said termination for convenience, do you want to be the one that explains to the CEO, yeah, I signed the contract, but I did not know that they could just cancel it any day, any time within the next 5 years, and we have nothing that we can say or do about it. We will not be entitled to any of the money. That's something you need to know, right? That's a big deal.
I would, that would be an oversight. Yeah. Well, at the very least, you've opened our eyes to this. I truly believe this is I know this is a horrible time and it's a global pandemic, but there's opportunity. There is always opportunity in the world. This does not mean business is over. This does not mean the countries are shut down. We are going to move forward, and this too shall pass, as they say. And maybe something will happen in the future that's very similar. But what we need to do as business owners is get ourselves ready. And so Christoph, thank you so much for educating us on this. I have a feeling I might get some feedback that says we need to have you back to talk more about sub and prime contractors. We'll leave that for the future. But thank you so much. Sorry, before we go, how do I get in touch with you, or how does a listener, viewer, get in touch with you if we need to?
So anybody can email me whenever they want. It's Christoph, that's Christoph, Christoph at ChristophLLC.com. You'll find that also on my website, which is ChristophLLC.com. And if you email me or go to my website, you can sign up for my monthly free newsletter. So every month I give you free advice. It's insider tips and knowledge about government contracts. And it comes to your email inbox every single month for free. And then, of course, if you don't find me on my website, ChristophLLC.com, go find my book on Amazon, Government Contracts in Plain English. I think you'll find it very helpful if you're already in the government contract space or if you're thinking about it. In either case, I think you'll really like it.
Yeah. This has been such an eye-opening interview, and I think so well-timed with this COVID pandemic going on. So thank you very much, Christoph. I appreciate having you on the show. Have a great day and be safe.
Thank you so much, Tom. Everybody out there listening, be safe. Keep the work going, though. We need our economy to survive. So you business owners, you're the key to that. So keep it going, and thank you so much, Tom. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.